Hey, just thought I'd take a moment to clarify some stuff about one of my favorite philosophers, Emmanuel Levinas. And since he's a pretty central part, and you do need to understand him a bit better for your reflection for number 12. So I know you're used to seeing Mr. Johnson's face, but a few people have asked for a little bit of clarification on Levinas, and so I'm happy to give that. So if you don't mind, take a moment to listen to this, and we'll go through the slides together. So just to back up here, Emmanuel Levinas, there's a good picture of him. I was lucky enough actually to have a professor in university who learned and studied rather directly under Emmanuel Levinas. So he went to university in France where Levinas was working near the end of his life in the early 90s. So that was pretty cool. I got some neat stories that way that don't really have time to share with you now, but rest assured he is an amazing human being. We can say that his ethics are an ethics of the face. And what that means is that he very much believed that ethics began when you look at the face of another human being. That ethics don't exist in a vacuum. They don't exist necessarily in and of themselves, per se. I don't know if he would have rejected those outright, but certainly he said they become real when we are face to face with another person. And so another way of titling that is relational ethics. So basically that means that ethics are found in relationship and that we become ethical in relationship. So just a little bit about Levinas, because it is quite a fascinating story. He's one of the more recent philosophers, certainly that we look at in this course and that you look at, I think, really throughout your career in education. He was born in Kaunas, Lithuania. So he was a Jew. He lived during the Holocaust with his Jewish family. Began studies at the University of Strasbourg in philosophy, and he saw a contrast between Western philosophy and his strong Jewish faith. Now, we Westerners, we tend to have a habit of trying to categorize things by saying what's similar about them, which feels like a good thing to do because we do it all the time. We might say, hey, you and I can be friends because we share the same interests. We both like hockey, or we both like heavy metal music, or we both like, short hair, or we're the same because we look the same, we dress the same, we sing the same, we walk the same. And we try to establish the similarities, and we say, hey, this is why we can get along. And it really ties to our questions of identity. So we try to establish what's the same between us, which feels like, I mean, that's how friendships start, right? You don't hang out with people you have nothing in common with. So it doesn't feel wrong. It's not wrong, but certainly he saw a contrast between these. Like, philosophically, maybe that doesn't work perfectly. Maybe it's important to embrace difference and otherness and uniqueness. So you might remember rationalism. We talked about that earlier on in the course. Basically, the idea that we can come to ideas through the rational use of our mind, and that kind of happens almost, can happen by ourselves. Jewish spirituality it does occasionally challenge that, as does Christian spirituality. We come from the same Judeo-Christian heritage, and basically, these don't seem like rational statements. These ones here: "He who saves a single life saves the world entire." That's from the Talmud. That doesn't seem rational, right? Like, what do you mean? If I save a single life, I've saved everything. That doesn't make sense. And so does Christian spirituality, because we believe that each life is of infinite value. Well, wait, if your life's of infinite value, what about mine, right? Like, some people might see those as contradictory statements. They certainly are not, but some people might. Levinas did live through World War II, and this, like as we discussed in some of Mr. Johnson had in some of those videos earlier, really about some of the profound effects of the First World War, certainly on modernism, and the profound effects of the Second World War. This, horrific, unimaginable horror that happened during the Second World War, and how that impacted people's, perspectives and really the overall milieu of the time. So, World War II, pretty impactful for Levinas as well. He was caught by the Germans and was a prisoner of war for about 5 years. He never really spoke about this a lot, but I'm sure it was a very tragic time. He did lose most of his family, his extended family for sure, and even his immediate family in concentration camps, World War II, and this made him more aware of the other. Now, what we mean by that is that he really struggled with this, as we well should. How can it be that every person, according to Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, every person is created in the image and likeness of God? If that's true, how can it be that somebody who is created in the image and likeness of God can treat another person who is created also in the image and likeness of God? How can they treat them as so horribly? How can they subject them to terrible things? How can they put them through a concentration camp? How can they reject their humanity? And that made him aware of the other. He's like, well, actually, kind of what we do, we see that person as less than human. Otherwise, if we saw them as truly human, we wouldn't do those horrible things to another person. We would see them as ourselves. We would see them as a trace of God. But when we see them as other and completely other to us, not as connected to us in any meaningful way, we reduce them. We reduce their humanity. So it's important that we just connect briefly with his Jewish roots. So he studied philosophy in the Talmud. So those are the Jewish books of law. And he also instructed young Jewish intellectuals in France. So he had this kind of really amazing intellectual faith-based tradition that he was teaching, which was really amazing. His last years in 1973 became a philosopher at Sorbonne. That's where my professor, Dr. Dudiak, went and took some courses from him, studied under him directly. It was pretty amazing. And that's where he wrote his famous book. Just after he wrote his famous book, he basically published it while he started there, called Totality and Infinity. Not totalitarianism, that's a different thing. Totality and Infinity. So he soon retired, and then would take on certain students. So Dr. Dudiak was certainly pretty happy, I think, to be taken on as one of his few students during the early 90s, just before his death in 95. Even in lecturing, he took his Jewish values very seriously. He never lectured on the Sabbath, so the Saturdays, no Saturday lectures. I mean, that's pretty common maybe for a lot of people, but he didn't do any work at all. So, you wanted to make an appointment with the professor. Sorry, if he had some important marking to do or some important work to do, it didn't happen on the Sabbath. In his own writings, one of my favorite popes, Pope John Paul II, used Levinas's ideas and discussed with him often. There's a picture of them chatting it up. So his teaching really is about a wisdom of love. In Levinas's view, so most people think of philosophy as the love of wisdom, but he tried to flip that around a little bit, and I love this because he's like, it's the wisdom of love, because by loving, we experience wisdom. I think that's really profound. In his view, the responsibility of the other precedes any objective searching after truth. So what that means is before I can figure out what's true and what's right and what's good, I actually have to start loving the person in front of me. And I think that that's very profound. I have to love the person in front of me, and in that I'll find the ethics. So that kind of flips things, because a lot of us like to get our ducks in a row first. We like to be like, well, I'll get my right understanding, and then I'll love, or then I can serve another person. And he's like, just do it, really. And so he doesn't find morality like some of our previous guys do. It's not that he doesn't think it's inscribed in the will of God. He actually does believe that. He's a God-fearing man. But that's not the only place that actually we find that then breathed into, is the language from even the book of Genesis, breathed into humankind. And we experience it in other people. He doesn't find it in reason. He doesn't think you can just come to it in your mind, although, that's not, he wouldn't reject reason. And it's certainly, the one thing he would reject is in a universal desire for pleasure. He'd be like, no, it's not about avoiding pain. In fact, people do some pretty amazing things that bring them pain and suffering that others might benefit, that we might find the good. So he's like, Bentham and Mill, you guys are kind of like dumbos. So the other, Levinas is not concerned with the proposition of laws or moral rules. He's like, no, we don't start with a rule, we start with love. So really, it's not to discover the truth of ethics, rather, but to make an appeal for ethical transformation in which we find truth. I know that seems contradictory, maybe seems like just wordsmithing, but this is vital for him. Levinas invites us to listen not only to what he has to say, but to others. Others matter. And that's where we find the trace of God. So when defining ethics, he would say there can't be ethics without two people. What would the point be, right? Like, I'm sitting in a vacuum. How can I be ethical? There's nobody to hurt. There's nobody to help. So there's ethics when two people are. So maybe that's more common sense than it seems. But he was the first one to really kind of point that out. And so to say ethics is an important issue because it governs the way we relate to one another. So further on, we got some comments there about St. Thomas, Immanuel Kant, and John Stuart Mill, and basically all of them, at least their aspects would connect to this idea as well. If ethics is concerned with the other, then the root of it really becomes to establish the source of contact between persons. And like, so like, where does that source of contact really come from is another way of putting that. Where does that source? So I've got the little clip here from 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4-7. You've probably heard it before. Love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, is not boastful, right? Love always trusts, hopes, perseveres, love never fails. This love of God is where Levinas finds the ethical. So what is the other? To a non-philosopher, that seems like a silly question. It's just the person we meet on the street. It's somebody we don't know. Do they have a mind? Are they a creation of my imagination? Is the questions that the first existentialists and many philosophers have asked. Like, do you really exist, or am I projecting you somehow? And even if you do really exist, do I really know you? So Descartes particularly was preoccupied with those, and so he's the I think therefore I am guy. And he basically just said, hey, if you're a projection of my mind, then how can I really know you? But given this view towards ideas, anytime I perceive or presuppose my idea of what a person should be, I close off connection with them. So we can use Descartes here with Levinas to be like, if I assume I know you, what we say when somebody assumes you know somebody, right? You make an assumption. Anyway, but I actually cut off my connection with that other person. So Levinas actually called this a form of violence, where we totalize the other person. This totalization. It means I limit that other person to a category. I look at you and I know you, even though I don't know you, right? I don't know your innermost thoughts. I don't know, like, everybody's fighting a battle you know nothing about, right? We've heard that saying before, but like this brings back even more. I look at you and I'm like, oh, you're a male. You're white, you are, in your 40s. So I know what you're about, man. And that's very limiting. And Levinas calls that a type of violence. So totalization, the reason it's violence is because it's a denial of your difference, and your difference matters. This is the key for Levinas to bring it all together. It's face-to-face relationship, because that's where ethics exist. And then it's about celebrating the uniqueness and not limiting the difference of other people. So the other exists independent of me, and I can't reduce you. If I do, I don't treat you as human. And he's like, this is what the Nazis did to him and his family, right? They reduced him. They didn't treat him as human. They totalized him. So in his work, Totality Infinity, quick little summary of this is here for you. You could read it, but basically, he said that Westerners, people with this mindset of like, we got to find similarity, that we were guilty of thinking away difference. We keep trying to see what our similarities are, thinking that's the answer. And he's like, actually, that's the problem. We need to celebrate our differences. Provided those differences are good. I mean, he wouldn't be like, oh, you think the murder's okay? Well, that's fine. That's a difference. No. Obviously there are some truths that are immutable, but for him, he's like, hey, like we're different, and like, let's celebrate that. So each person, the most fascinating quality for him was that each person is unique, that we are reflections of the infinite. So totality, we don't want to totalize people. We don't want to think we know them, the total beingness of them. They are reflections of God's love and a trace of God, and they are infinity. So like Aristotle and Kant's ethics, Levinas is a search for the good. So he thought that we see the good in the face of the other people. So this brings it along for us, right? It's relational ethics. We see the goodness in the face of other people, and that's the trace of goodness. That's the trace of God. That we can't limit. That helps. We can't reduce that. Then the person, doesn't matter if they're the poorest beggar on the street or the richest king or queen. We actually we see the trace of God in them, and realize that I can't limit them. I can't reduce them. So how do we achieve the good? Well, we got to orient ourselves to the other. We've got to be focused on the other, put them above us, put them before us. This is what Jesus taught, even though Levinas was a Jew and not a Christian. So he didn't really he knew what Jesus taught. And he would have agreed with this, but like, this is what Jesus really unpacks for us, is that, the last shall be first, right? And that we've got to serve all. This actually holds us responsible, holds us hostage, is what he says in another place. So, you can maybe think of a time where you had a face-to-face interaction with somebody else, and like, you just couldn't ignore them. It's very easy to ignore another person and their ethical request and to treat them as if they don't matter if you don't look at them in the face. Look at somebody in the face and see their pleading eyes, see what their face of need, and all of a sudden it's a heck of a lot harder to say no. You are held hostage. You are responsible to them. And Levinas said that's reality. That's a good thing. So the search for the good ends. Levinas's ethics doesn't bend us in God's direction. It twists us in the direction of our neighbor. So he says, you find God, you find ethics through your neighbor. God's infinite goodness touches us without our knowledge. It's always indirect, he thought. That's where he differs, I think, a little bit from maybe Catholicism. We believe that although we don't have the channel directly of God, we do have the Eucharist. We like literally hold God, the body of Jesus Christ, right? But God's touch is always indirect for Levinas, and it's always through the other person. But certainly that is easily embraceable within Catholic Christian spirituality. So God leaves a trace in the face of the other, and we are called as Christians to see Jesus in the face of the other. So this fits together real well. So the rest of these slides here are just like summaries of theories and stuff, but I want to just pause here for a second. Maybe I can put a nice there. We'll have a nice picture. The reflection that you're called to do on this course has you look at identity politics, and which are a pretty huge problem, I think, in today's society. We see it more and more on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, any place where there's social media. There are very polarized opinions, and people say, these are my people. Those are the other people, and we can't. There's no room for dialogue. I'm just going to shout in my echo chamber over here, and these people shout in their echo chamber over here, and everything gets characterized and categorized into those categories, right? Into our identity, because we want to seek, we're Westerners, we want to seek similarity, and we want to know our people. I think the question is trying to get you to think about something that I think is important, which is how is Levinas's celebration of uniqueness, his celebration of the face of the other, of finding ethics in relationship with other people, how is that an antidote or like a possible remedy or solution or way through the problem of identity politics? So if you're unclear on identity politics, you can certainly research more on what that looks like in today's society. But it's pretty simple to see in like actual political parties, right? It's pretty easy to see in people who have very strong opinions that are very polarizing. And Levinas, I think, provides us a way through that to say that maybe dialogue is the most important thing, and maybe we got to talk about some things, and maybe that's the way through. So God bless you for listening to this. I hope it helps you out, and God bless you guys. I hope you've enjoyed the course so far, and wish you well in the remaining few days. Thank you.